Mr. Professor, Mr. Wagenaar, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Great, thank you. I introduced this event, so I would like to ask you if you can start your presentation, if you can introduce us in your problematics, and it's all yours.
Thanks, and thanks for inviting me to come to Prague, however digitally. This is kind of an experiment, of course. Normally I see the audience and the lecture gets inspired by the audience, but now you're completely invisible. The audience is completely invisible. Maybe the audience doesn't even exist. We never know. And normally you see me jumping around in front of the PowerPoint and sometimes hitting somebody on the head who falls asleep. All this is not possible now, thanks to the brilliant little virus, and we have to try to do it in this way. I have a presentation with several themes. I will introduce them. First of all, I will find the machine and try to get the presentation online. And there we have it. So as you can see, this is called Hospital in the City, and it is a presentation that I did earlier in a summer school from the European Network Architecture for Health. It is not exactly that presentation, of course. I completely changed it. It's kind of a collage from different presentations that hopefully meet the requirements. I was planning to make a corona-free presentation. I think we're all more or less fed up with the little bastard. It's not entirely successful. I have to relate to it several times. But the main dish is about healthcare architecture now and in the future. And as we shall see in that respect, this corona business will not have a major effect. How strange this may sound strange, but it is the case. So we have now I have to try to. Now this does not work. How does this work? We can do it like this. Yes, we have to do it in a bit different way. We have a table of contents of this collage. First of all, who is that guy? Why are we listening to that guy? Why are we not sitting in a bar, having fun, having dinner or whatever? Then I have some preliminary remarks. Then I go to the hospitals, then to cities, and then I try to merge the two topics by talking about the hospital and the city. This has to stay here. So, who is that guy? Who am I? Well, I'm Cor Wagenaar, as you have heard. I am part of the Department of History of Art, Architecture and Landscapes. That is a part of the University of Groningen, a city in the north of the Netherlands. I have the chair of History and Theory of Architecture and Urbanism. And I also had an expertise center, which is about architecture, urbanism, and health. So that comes in handy in the present situation. Let me talk about this thing for a short while. What we do is, well, we combine several things, but our basis is classical architectural and urban history. With a special twitch, we have special interest in how buildings and cities are used. So the use is a specifically important thing for us. Well, you know what you can expect if you deal in a field, if you work in a field like that. We talk about program, and we talk about architecture, we talk about styles, about topologies, construction function, iconographies, all the things that you can expect if you teach or learn classical architecture history. Urbanism, basically the same thing. We talk about planning, about functional zoning, about connections. We talk about design, and people who want to, focus on this side of the fields, they can expect to be hired as a cultural heritage assessment professional or work on environmental impact analyses and things like that. We also have an architecture, we also focus on architecture, urbanism and health. That is why we have this expertise center. And if you do, if you decide to work in that side of what we offer, you talk about cities, their physical qualities, about pollution, about sewage systems, about the disposal of waste. We will see more of that later on. Ecology, lifestyles, and if we go to the level of buildings, we talk about physical qualities, site topologies, and things like that. And also, as a special category, healthcare buildings. Then we talk about programs, about planning, and about design. Well, if you decide to focus on that side of what we offer, your jobs may be in consultancy and management. You may become a researcher at architectural offices. Maybe you can join municipalities and work for in the policy-making field, all these things are possible if you do that. The unique thing of what we do is that we use classical architectural and urban history as the basis for our work in architecture, urbanism, and health. And that is basically our unique selling point, if that is the proper word, because most of the experts who deal with architecture and urbanism from the health perspective or from the public health side, they are public health experts, and what we often find is that the two fields, classical architecture on the one hand and public health on the other hand, are very difficult to combine. They speak totally different languages. Sometimes they even seem to hate each other. And there is a very strong, a strong tendency in the field of public health experts to monopolize everything that has to do with health, even if it is outside of their comfort zone. So that is our special mission, to approach the field from the opposite side, from classical architecture and urban history. And this then is the complete equation. This is what we do, and if you want to know more about that, we have a website that is under construction, but you can already visit it, and then you will find what we do in terms of research and also in terms of education. The master that also combines these two fields. Then some preliminary remarks. You see, we go quite fast. We have to say something about the present situation, so some preliminary remarks are in order. And the first is a very important one, and maybe the most important that you can state in the first place, which is why we begin with it. Health is not a medical condition. Not at all. Medicine is only a repair service if things go wrong, but it is nothing more than that. And that is something that we should remember. Medicine only comes into play when something goes wrong. And if we talk about health, we basically talk about a lot of other fields apart from medicine. Then, and that is important to stress in these times, in normal times, these times are not normal, in normal times, 85% of the burden of disease is caused by the so-called non-communicable diseases, the not contagious diseases like cancers, cardiovascular problems, things like that. And so far, this pandemic has not significantly changed this at all, and in the long run, it will not be able to do that. If we take a look at China, for instance, the entire country had a lockdown. The consequences for the economy are disastrous. The social consequences are dramatic. But in terms of public health, in the statistics, it is hardly visible at this point, almost invisible. And if we talk about public health, that is also important to stress, we talk about statistics. Health is a very personal thing, but public health is all about statistics. Statistically, so far, this entire pandemic, in terms of health, not in terms of economy and social effects, but in terms of health, has had very, very little effect. Unfortunately, that may change in the coming weeks, and it probably will, but so far, this is not the case at all. Well, and then there's an important statement, the healthcare infrastructure, so these hospitals, psychiatric clinics, and things like that, they are responsible for only 10% of public health. And that is where we come into play. Architecture and urbanism play a very substantial role in the remaining 90%. That is why we talk about these issues in this lecture. Here is a site, there is a link, and I'm not sure if you can get this lecture somehow as a PDF or whatever. I think your people from camp can take care of that. Then you can take a look at this site, and then you will find a lot of data on the relative weight of different fields of policy on public health. This site also claims that only 10% of public health can be attributed to the healthcare infrastructure. And that is why the World Health Organization has decided to focus on a strategy that is called Health and All Policies. And then they focus on governance, they focus on social issues, on economic issues, spatial issues, on all kinds of issues that normally we do not see as part of public health budgets, but that have a much bigger impact on public health than the entire medical infrastructure. Well, what can architecture and urbanism do if it comes to contagious diseases like this nice corona thing we have now? Then we have to admit that it cannot do a lot. It can have an impact on the general health level, and the healthier a population is, the less problems contagious diseases will cause. But in general, we can say that the main impact of architecture and urbanism is not with contagious diseases, but on the non-communicable diseases like cancers and heart diseases and things like that. So we have to be honest, in this crisis that we have now, which is why we have this strange lecture in this way, streaming and totally digital and totally online, architecture and urbanism cannot do a lot about contagious diseases. The good thing is that they generally disappear quite quickly, in 2 years at most, and then for decades nothing may happen. But if they come, then we will always have the same problems, and we have seen this type of problem coming for quite some time. Now we have the problem, and we have to wait until it disappears. Having said this, these were the preliminary remarks. We now could go to des Pudels Kern, as the Germans would have it, to the main body of this lecture. And then we start with hospitals. And why do we start with hospitals? We start with hospitals because there some things are very clear that are actually true for everything that has to deal, that has bearing on health. And that is this thing, if we talk about healthcare architecture, what is so special about healthcare architecture? Well, it is that everything is about performance. Now, buildings are always about performance. Performance in terms of energy, in terms of sustainability, in terms of cost efficiency. If an architecture builds a building that only loses money and is not fit for its function, this architect will be out of a job quite soon. All this is totally normal. It goes for all buildings. But what is specific for healthcare buildings is that we talk about performance in terms of health outcomes. That is a very different and very specific field. And here you have a interesting, I think, and short and small summary of what we are talking about when we talk about performance in healthcare. Above this black thing, you have several fields that define the performance of healthcare buildings. And these all have an effect on medical outcomes, and that is what it is all about. Healthcare systems play a very big role. If you have a system that is inaccessible for most of the citizens, then this system will perform very badly. Even if the quality of the healthcare buildings themselves and of the medical system is super high. This, for instance, is the case in the United States. Super high quality of medical care, but totally inaccessible, and the result is a very bad and underperforming health system, and they will pay very dearly for this in the present crisis. So this is one of the decisive things for healthcare. Another thing that is important in healthcare buildings is management, and we come to that later. You can organize hospitals in different ways. You can talk about care pathways and cluster specific diseases, which leads to a very specific logistical layout of hospitals. You can foster translational ways of working, many things that have to do with management. And then we come to the built environment, the building itself, and then we talk about architecture. Well, talking about architecture, we have different things that have an impact on health outcomes. And one is about sustainability. Of course, if you build a hospital, it is very important that you don't make it wasteful buildings in terms of energy consumption and all kinds of other things that have to do with sustainability. But the direct effects on people lying in hospital are almost zero. They are very, very indirect. We have to take it into account, however, because we have to take care that we do not ruin our human habitat. Human beings are the only creatures on the planet that have a tendency to destroy their own habitat, and sustainability is one of the things that can try to help prevent that. Then, the accommodation of medical processes in a hospital. This has a direct effect on medical outcomes. So this is a thing that is super important for architects who work in this field to know what are the medical processes that we have to deal with and how should we accommodate them. Then logistics, the flow of staff, of inpatients, outpatients, visitors, and food, and all kinds of goods. That is very, very important in the way a hospital functions, and it has a very direct impact on how a hospital actually performs in terms of medical outcomes. And now we come to the last one, and that is a very important one, and that is one that has been recently rediscovered, only since the 1980s, you can say, and that is the quality of design. The quality of design also can have an impact on medical outcomes. But here there is something very specific that we have to take into account, and that is that this impact is not direct, but there is a very important interface. And this interface is about human experiences, about emotions, and about feelings. And if these feelings and emotions are positive, it has a positive, identifiable, measurable effect on health outcomes. However, this is a very complex relationship. This field is studied by different disciplines. For example, psychology plays a role, environmental psychology, obviously, sociology, economics, corporate real estate, also very important, industrial design. All these things study how this interface works. And architecture should also study these effects. And recently, not very recently, the last, let's say 30, 40 years, it has started to do so. So this is the general picture if we talk about performance in terms of healthcare buildings. It can be very direct, it can be very indirect, and in terms of design, it is indirect, and there is this very important interface, human experiences, emotions, and feelings. Performance is what it is all about, performance in terms of health, well, in terms of health outcomes, of medical outcomes. Now, we take this notion of performance to the next level, and that is the level of cities. And normally, I see a huge audience in front of me, and I can do this quiz. It is a very simple quiz. It is the most simple quiz that you have ever seen in your life. The question is, which of the two urban settings has the best effects on public health? Which has the best medical outcomes? To the left, you see Manhattan. Manhattan is a very dense metropolitan city. It's a metropolis, it's big, it's noisy, it's crowded. And on the other hand, to the right, we have suburbia, suburban setting. In this case, it's the city of Almere. It's more of a suburb, very low density, a lot of greenery, nice houses. There is a house you see here by a firm called Onyx, very decent architectural firm, they make beautiful things. So then the question is, which of the two systems, the metropolis of suburbia, has the best medical outcomes? Now, I would say hands up for Almere, and then hands up for Manhattan. I have no idea how the quiz works out digitally. I don't see you, so I'm going to give away the answer. And the answer is that Manhattan, the metropolis, functions or scores or performs a whole lot better than suburbia. This is very definitely something that is counterintuitive. So normally my audience is, 80% of my audience says it's suburbia, it's green, must be good. It is not the case at all. It is Manhattan. And why is that? Why is the metropolis, the high density city, more effective than suburbia? Well, this is very simple reasons. For instance, mobility. In Manhattan, everybody walks, and car ownership is, unlike the rest of America, very, very low. And walking has been identified as one of the phenomena that has a highly, very, extremely positive effect on health. Some experts say that if you sit on your ass, if I may be that unparliamentary, until your 40th year, and then start moving, just moving as part of your daily rhythm patterns, walking from home to work, for instance, then you might live even 10 years longer than if you just keep on sitting and use the car. Another thing is in Manhattan there are lots of social hubs, and social isolation has been recognized as a recipe for catastrophe. In Almere, in suburbia, there are not that many social hubs, and people stay at home. Access to healthy food, very easy in Manhattan, almost impossible in suburbia. Access to greenery, well, there is a lot of greenery in suburbia, but nobody uses it because nobody uses it. So they see it as unsafe and they keep out. In Manhattan, on the other hand, there is not that much of greenery. The Central Park, relatively speaking, is very small compared to the number of inhabitants, but it is very much used by the people who live in Manhattan, and it has a very positive effect. I could go on for ages, but I won't. What I try to prove in this little setup is that indeed the way we organize our cities has a thorough impact on public health. And now we go to healthy cities. And I start with a historical overview of several urban strategies. This is historical, but on the other hand, it is not. All of these strategies they are from the past, but they are still valid today, and they are also still practiced today. And then I will start with healthy cities today. So we go and take a look at the first strategy. And the first strategy, still in place today, is get the hell out of the city. This is a picture, a map of Amsterdam in the 17th century. You recognize it, of course. This city was extremely dirty. You could smell the city 3 kilometers out of its borders. And it had, well, not very positive health effects. And statistics in the 18th century, not very well validated in today's terms, they proved without doubt that life in cities was very much more unhealthier than life on the countryside, and people on the countryside lived considerably longer. Of course, this effect was particularly strong with the lower classes, but the effect was very much there. So, what do you want to do? You want to get the hell out of the city. And in the Netherlands, but not only in the Netherlands, you will have the same effect in Prague. Many people decided to have, if they could afford it, their own landed estate on the countryside. And health was one of the explicit motives to leave the city and live on the countryside, especially in the summertime. So we have lots and lots of these gardens and country estates everywhere in the Netherlands and everywhere in Europe. And if we continue this line of the Great Escape, then we see that it has continued. This tendency to move to landed estates on the countryside was something for the aristocracy and wealthy citizens. Other people could not afford it. It became also something for the elite. Everybody knows this guy, Thoreau, who wrote Walden, published it in 1850, had an experiment in 1845. He lives alone in the woods and experienced all kinds of spiritual things, but he was fleeing the city, and he believed that living on the countryside was a morally better and also a healthier way to live. This is a system that became popular in the early 20th century. Has its roots in England. It's the Garden City model, and this, in principle, was intended for everybody. It was a miniature, big city, but it was very definitely a miniature city, very green, limited in size, and it was intended by Howard, who first thought of this concept, to replace the metropolis. All these things we still do. In the 20s and 30s, we also started to build garden cities for the wealthy people. This is Frohnau here in Berlin. You will have the same type of settlements in Prague. And also in the 30s, we built siedlungen for the lower classes, like we have over here. This is Uncle Tom's Hütte. You probably know it. It's by the town, very beautiful here in Berlin. Undoubtedly, you have the same thing in Prague and in Czechoslovakia in general as well. All this is escape. We escape from the city. And the same philosophy, in a slightly different way, we can also see in post-war neighborhoods. You have many of these neighborhoods in the city of Prague. Marijke Meteen and I, we once did a lecture on these housing estates. They are of super high quality, especially also compared to the Netherlands. Here you have a Berlin example. It's a bit of an exotic one. It's Gropiusstad. The exotic thing is that density is actually quite high, but it was still intended as an alternative for the traditional 19th century highly densely built up metropolis. So escape remained a thing that is very, very important, and that is the first strategy in terms of healthy cities. Scusi. That is strategy 1. Now we go to strategy 2. Strategy 2 has to do with pandemic, epidemic diseases like we have today. And as you know, this corona thing, this corona little virus, this little bastard, it travels by air, it travels by fast means of transportation that we have today, which is why it is uncontainable and got out of control, except in China, but in the rest of the world quite rapidly. In old times, this was a bit differently. In the Middle Ages, viruses also came mostly from the east, but they walked on foot, literally. This changed in the 19th century with the advent of modern streamlined transportation systems, and then these viruses could reach us much faster, and they usually ended up first in port cities. And this is a map of Hamburg, 1832. A cholera epidemic arrives from the east, and this gave rise to a kind of a medical mapping process. And we see that the darker areas were hit hardest by the virus, and this proved without doubt that there was a very direct relationship between living conditions on the one hand and contagious diseases on the other hand. And if we map the conditions in the dark areas, we can try to analyze these conditions, and then we can try to do something about it. And that led to the hygienic revolution and to the sanitation campaign that happened all over Europe, the United States, in the 19th century. It was a huge campaign. It was a very, very, very expensive campaign, and it was also a super, super efficient campaign. The most important things were sewage systems. We have sewage systems everywhere, and also very important was the supply of clean water. These two things had an immediate effect on public health, and with the benefit of hindsight, we can say that probably very few interventions in space or in health in general have had a bigger effect than this hygienic revolution. It also completely changed the health relationships between cities and the countryside. The countryside was much healthier than cities before the hygienic revolution, and after the hygienic revolution, this changed, and now cities were much healthier than the countryside. And I always conclude this part with this, and you have many of these manhole covers in Prague as well, and sometimes I invite my students to sit down, kneel, and kiss these things. Without them, we cannot live in cities. It is as simple as that. We go to the third strategy, and the third strategy is about public housing. Here I have a slide on a Dutch public housing law that is not interesting for you. What is interesting, that public housing, of course, attracted architects who were very well aware of the effect of what they did on public health, and they more or less began to behave like doctors. Not only that, they sometimes started to dress like doctors. Here you have two people, Jos Kleinen, not very famous outside the Netherlands, but he is wearing a doctor's coat. This is really a doctor's coat and not a dust coat, as some people think it is, but it is a doctor's coat. He sees himself as a doctor. And the guy that you see here, not in a doctor's coat, but sitting beside somebody in his office who has a doctor's coat, is Cornelis van Eesteren, famous architect from the style movement, a modern architect, president of the CIAM in the 1930s. He also believed that architecture could be seen, urban planning even more, as a medicine, and that he was a doctor. So the planner as a doctor heals the city, and if he heals the city makes its citizens much more healthy. Doctors also started, urbanists I should say, also started to diagnose the systems. They found diseases related to living and working conditions, alcohol use, overburdening. That were the symptoms, and they diagnosed it as being caused by housing shortage, by lack of leisure time, lack of recreational facilities, chaotic conditions, thanks to the lack of zoning, all these things. And this called for two models, two strategies to come to terms with that. One is the garden city that we already encountered, and the other is a large-scale urban blocks. The first is the garden city. Here we have the most famous in the Netherlands, which is in Rotterdam. It's called Vreewijk. The advantages is that the housing is relatively cheap to build. It's inexpensive. the environment is green, and this should contribute to health. You have garden cities you have all over the world, and you have them in Prague as well. The other strategy, which you also will find in Prague and everywhere basically, is dense tenement blocks, but built according to a very strict building code and endowed with all the facilities that are needed to make these blocks healthy. And the advantages are that it is relatively inexpensive to introduce decent water supply systems and sewage systems, and you can introduce collective facilities as well, as for instance a bathing house. It was not at all common for labor classes, for working class people, to live in houses that had their own baths. So you could have a collective bath in the building that was part of these huge collective blocks. This, by the way, is the Van Justus complex, also in Rotterdam, quite famous. It has an elevated street. And this was one of the things that, one of the two strategies that were introduced in the 1920s, 1930s. Now, of course, you can introduce new strategies. You have to introduce new strategies, but life continues and shapes new realities. And here is a thing that at first sight seems a bit odd, but has a huge effect on health conditions, and that are the working conditions in society. In the 1920s, many countries witnessed what was called an administrative revolution, and the number of office jobs increased dramatically, and the number of menial jobs slowly decreased. And if you have changed relationships between these two types of jobs, it will have an immediate effect on the types of diseases that you will have. Menial labor has all kinds of physical problems, and office work often has all kinds of psychological problems, stress and things like that. So the way society works literally has an impact on health as well. We go to the sixth strategy, which is another strategy, and an interesting one, and again one where architects and urbanists were heavily involved. The symptoms and the diagnosis was much the same, so not much changed, but now people became very much aware of the fact that there were not so many scientific data available. And in architecture and urbanism, this was particularly seen as particularly disadvantageous. So something needed to be done about that. We needed to go to change to a more rational approach of things, and that found its way into two strategies. One is modernism, which celebrated light, sun, fresh air, sports and leisure, and you know all about that, and also the elimination of everything that is superfluous. So we want to be rational, we want to behave like managers, we want to do away with everything that is not functional, and health was a major motive in the modern movement. You see to the right a thing that you immediately recognize, of course. These are the health houses by Nutra. We built many of them, Neutra, I should say. And this is an example of modern housing that is supposed to be healthy. This, of course, is the famous Weissenhofsiedlung, a terribly bad urban plan, but that doesn't matter. It's a show, and this show shows the advantages of modern architecture. Sports played a major role in the modern world as well. Sports facilities also played a major role, and public housing also became subjects to modern planning and modern architecture. Here you see das Neue Frankfurt, probably the largest public housing project built according to the principles of modernism. And to the left you have one of the famous projects, small but interesting, in Rotterdam, actually in Hoek van Holland. You must recognize that immediately. We go to the seventh strategy, and the seventh strategy is the regional city. And now this is a very interesting one. This is a planning one. We want to have nature in the city. We want to combine rural countryside and the city. We want actually to merge them. And we see the city as a functional organism. All this is based on surveys. We want to have an harmonious interplay of cities and landscapes. The garden city movement that used to be anti-metropolitan, anti-urban, now became part of the urban reform movement that actually happened at a conference in 1924 in Amsterdam. Zoning became important. Well, I could go on and on for ages, will not do so, but this led to very interesting projects like this one for Rotterdam. Rotterdam by Witteveen, this plan. He had the idea that Rotterdam should explode, should become a metropolitan city of 2.5 million citizens. And the entire city is permeated, is saturated with green wedges. And these green wedges were very important in planning in the 1930s. So you can walk through the city in a green environment, in a relatively high density, yet in a green environment, and never leave the green environment. It's compact, it is well zoned, and this is the ideal of the 1920s, 1930s. The scheme to the top left, you know, of course, this is the radial model of city planning. That is the opposite of the concentric model. So here we have green wedges that almost stretch out into the urban core, and on the other hand, the urbanized fingers, they stretch out in the green countryside. To the right, you see a still from a movie, Die Stad van Morgen, 1929, and it shows the same principles. In the meantime, life continues, and now we face some major catastrophes. First of all, the economic depression of the 1930s, that is social segregation, super bad thing, and we also had the Second World War with lots and lots of casualties, so we had new problems at hand, and we wanted to do something about these problems. And this led to a new type of strategy in which the health definition expanded and now incorporated social things, social aspects. Social cohesion became one of the most important things. And of course, it was the opposite of fragmentation, of social segregation, of ethnic segregation, of racism, and all these terrible things that devastated the mid-20th century. This is the opposite. This is an answer to all that. And these principles, they had a huge impact on the post-war housing estate. Living was seen as a tool to forge new ways of living. Housing was seen as a tool to forge new ways of living. The advantages of this model, it was a modular model, was that we had a hierarchical composition in separate units. All these units are complete in their own right. We live in a green environment, and that we found out was in the end probably the most important motive to build these things. They offer more safety during air raids, and that of course was a thing that was very much in the minds of people in the mid-20th century and after the Second World War. This is a slide that shows you some of the advantages. The system banks on the wholeness of life, so all facilities needed for the completeness of life should be available on all hierarchical spatial levels. Functionalism was important. It would prevent waste. Living was still seen as an educational device. Each level was marked by its center. Very important. In the Netherlands, for instance, in these post-war housing estates, we did not build shopping streets any longer. We built centers, shopping centers, cultural centers, sports centers, and the like. And this caused a very radical break with pre-war urban models. It was the end of landscape preservation, which was one of the models of 1930s town planning and urbanism. It also ended the ideal of compact cities, and it ushered in a period of suburbia. To the left, you see the classical way of urbanization before 1950. Everybody flocks to the central city, and to the right you see the way we did it after the 1950s. The central cities lose part of the population to the cities in the vicinity, and the cities in the vicinity also attract people from the countryside. This is the origin of suburbia. And it caused lots of problems as well. These things were completely car dependent, but the car caused problems in terms of sedentary lifestyles. Immediately, it caused many accidents, and it caused traffic jams and a lot of stress. These post-war housing estates were causing stress anyways. They were seen by sociologists especially, but also by psychologists, as stress machines. Here you have a few images from suburbia in the United States, where in general it was seen as positive, unlike what we had in Europe. We saw it as negative right from the start. And people started to diagnose these post-war housing estates, and they found that the number of ulcers increased by 40%. That is a lot. Days lost by illness increased by 100%. That is even more. And 30 to 50% of all complaints were the consequence of psychosomatic problems. And these were partly environmental, especially noise was a problem. Housing shortage did not do a lot of good, and collective housing policies were very much a cause of problems, especially for those people who came from the countryside and moved to cities. This book is a book that you probably know, Medicijn und Städtebouw. It's a famous book. It talks about the impact of urbanism on public health, and here the authors, this is 1957, they state, and this is a very harsh statement, that living in suburbia actually causes more mental diseases than if you sit in a historical city in the 1940s and the city is being bombed. So there was very, very heavy criticism against these modern post-war housing estates that we built in the 1950s and the 1960s, and this triggers the 9th strategy, which was all about psychology. And this model I have dubbed the cozy city. In the Netherlands we call it herbergzame stad. Each language has its own term for this, and it led to something that is completely different compared to what was there before. Before we did zoning, a lot of zoning, mono-functional zones. Now we mix everything. Before, the bureaucrats know what was good for the people and they just decreed it and built it, and now we have participatory processes. We ask the people what they think. And this led to completely new types of neighborhoods. I have no images included in them, but I'm pretty sure that you will find this type of urbanism also in Prague. Actually, I know for sure. We did this lecture once, Marek and I, on these post-war housing estates. And there was a process, at least before 1968, of humanizing these post-war housing estates. After 1968, things changed in Prague. In the Netherlands and in most of Western Europe, this did not happen, and we switched to a different type of basically psychology-based urban planning. Okay, this is history, but as I was saying before, it may be history, but it is also still what we see today. In principle, nothing has happened, and all these strategies are still used today, of course, in a contemporary way. And now we go to 9+ strategies, to strategy 10, which is healthy cities today. But before we go into that, I have a preamble. I have something that is very important to make clear from the start, and that is that we have switched our mental attitude to urbanism completely. We have completely changed it. Almost all of the strategies that I have shown before, not all, but most of them, were anti-urban. They were anti-metropolitan. They wanted to do away with the city. This is very much true for suburbia. It was also true for the garden city model. And now this has completely changed. One of the books that is associated with this change is by our own guy Rem Koolhaas, who wrote The Ladies of New York in 1978 already, which is a celebration of urban life. And we see this celebration of urban life now. It has become a general trend. People want to live not in suburbia, they want to live in cities. And the price level of cities makes this very, very clear. The darkest areas are most expensive, and they are most expensive because they are most attractive. Everybody wants to live there. And only if you cannot afford it do you consider living somewhere else, farther away from the urban center. You can also see this trend in advertising, in fashion, in how cars are being sold. Cars in the 1960s, 1950s were always depicted as instruments to escape from the city to the countryside and do some picnicking. Now we have urban cars. It is a trend that we see everywhere. So the car is a thing that is a thing of the past. If you go to a party, nobody makes a lot of nobody boasts about his car. If you meet somebody who boasts about his car, you think he must be crazy because he must be out of his mind, his or her mind. Now people brag about how much kilometers they walk or what bike they have, things like that. The car is now a thing that is, we use it, we cannot abolish it, we should not abolish it, but it is no longer king of the road, king of the cities, and determining basically everything. And this is a major change in urban planning. Then another major change, if you talk about health, is that the health aspects of architecture and urbanism have been rediscovered. I already mentioned this in the start, so I go on with what urban, healthy city planning is today. And then we have three levels, three very important levels. One is physical. We talk about the new miasms, about pollution in cities, and mainly about air pollution, but also about noise, about water, about heat islands, and things like that. If we thought that this problem was under control, we were mistaken. It is not under control at all, and we still have to do a lot about that. Then, and that is by far the most important issue if we talk about healthy cities, it is about health-threatening lifestyles. And these we can address very effectively with urban planning. And then on the global scale, we have depletion of raw materials, of energy, of food. We create all kinds of problems elsewhere on the planet. But it does not matter where we destroy the planet. If we destroy the planet, we destroy our own habitat and we will pay for it. First, the new miasms, the new pollution type of things. We talk about pollution, about physical conditions. We have a lot of what is now called fine dust in cities, caused mainly by the car. And this is extremely unhealthy, and there's nothing that we can do about it. If all this dirt is in the air, it is there to stay. Of course, it will disappear in the course of time. But the best remedy against it is stop producing it. We will probably produce less of it if we change to electrical cars, but then the car has many other problems as well. So the car is a thing that we have to come to terms with. Another thing is that we have, in many cases, also ruined indoor climate, and people spend 80 to 90% of their lives indoors. So this is very bad indeed. And the worst problems are in those houses that are insulated most effectively. We did a lot of insulation, especially since the 1970s, in order to save energy. But in doing so, we destroyed indoor climate. There are many handbooks. This is a Delft colleague of mine, of Philomena Bluisens. How can we make indoor climates more healthy? And basically, this sometimes calls for thorough reconstruction processes of our housing stock. Now we come to the most important part if it comes to public health and to urban and architectural measures, and that has to do with lifestyles. And we begin with a lifestyle that we cannot do a lot about in terms of architecture and urbanism, and that is drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and things like that. This is a lifestyle thing that escapes us as planners, and people just have to be informed that it is not very wise to do too much of all that. I would never say stop it completely, but be a bit careful about all this. Now we come to a thing that does happen to have a bearing on architecture and urbanism, and that is unhealthy food. And here we have a direct relationship with the outlets of healthy food. And we found, there is a lot of literature on that many post-war housing estates are what are called food deserts. They are food deserts. You can go to the McDonald's, you can eat a hamburger, you can eat fried potatoes and chips and whatever. But if you look for healthy food, then the outlets of healthy food are most scarce in post-war housing estates, and they are most easily to be found in much more densely populated areas. So that is a thing that has to do with the distribution model of cities, and something can be done about it. Probably the most important and the most effective one in terms of unhealthy lifestyles is the sedentary lifestyle, the sitting down lifestyle. People sit on their ass all day. They watch the screen, as most of you are obliged to do now. But in general, this is not a very wise thing to do. You have to move, you have to walk, and if you do that, that is one of the most healthy things that you can do. But our post-war housing estates, they are built for the car. Actually, urbanism in its post-war approaches to planning are completely dominated by the car, and the car produces situations that are unfit for cyclists and unfit for pedestrians. If you have a car in the street, all other users of the street become very, very difficult. The street uses its character as a place. Another thing, place in terms of placemaking, a place where you go in order to have social context, in order to play and things like that. If you have cars in the street, it becomes impossible. I already mentioned this one, social isolation, a recipe for catastrophe. Sitting alone, watching your screen is not doing a lot of good. The only thing that is helpful is meet people in real life, which is a thing that we cannot do today. Well, not much anyways, but that is one of the most healthy things from a social perspective what you can do. And social health prevents physical diseases and all kinds of complaints. You need social hubs for that. You need cities for that. You need places for that. And then greenery. I already mentioned greenery as something that is very important, but also as something that can sometimes be underused, and it is especially underused in post-war housing estates where there is not too much of it, but nobody uses it. And people see this abundance of public space, of green space, as unhealthy, as unsafe. And in some American parks, people decided that they were going to designate part of the park as a safe zone. It is very difficult to police a very big park, but it is easy, or at least easier, to police part of it, and that then becomes a safe park zone. So if people want to rob old ladies, they can easily do so, but not the safe zone. The safe zone is policed and is much more safe, and therefore much more likely to benefit people from the green impacts it has. Here we have the car again. The car monopolizes space, and if the car monopolizes space, it is unfit for use as a playground, as a social catalyst for all other types of use. Which is why in urban planning we have this ideal of what's called new urbanism. New urbanism has many roots, and it is something that has been going around for quite some time. But if you take a look at what they do, these new urbanists, you can see that it almost is comparable to what the handbook authors of the late 19th century proposed. This is by Stubben. It's a book, Der Städtebau, 1890. You will find it in all your libraries. And in all planning offices in the late 19th century, they used this book. And here you have a lot of public space that has not yet been destroyed by the car, and therefore is a source of inspiration for current planners. And if we talk about these streets that are used by pedestrians and by cyclists, and that are more or less let alone by, or not stampeded away by the car, then we talk about use, and use is something that is an important thing to study in architecture and urbanism. And here we have something that you immediately recognize. It's the famous American sociologist William H. White. He wrote many books. He also wrote The Organization Man. He's a sociologist, but in the 80s he started to study the social life of small urban places. And if you put that in your YouTube search engine, or just in YouTube, you will find very interesting movies. He did a very hilarious one on movable chairs, for instance. And that is about documenting how cities, how places are used. And that is something that is very, very important. Then we come to the last aspect of healthy cities today, and that has to do with the global scale, with sustainability. We should try to not deplete the planet. We should try to minimize fossil energy and move to other sources of energy. For instance, wind energy or also solar panels. And these two images are slightly primitive, or at least they show a primitive use of these alternative means. There was some research here in Germany not so long ago, which proved without doubt that these windmills are never located in the back gardens of the wealthy people. They are never in villa parks and in rich areas, and that is why they can be seen as markers of social depravity. They ruin landscapes, but where the landscapes are beautiful and healthy are living, they don't do that. Luckily now we try to build as many of them on the sea, at sea, and that problem can be mitigated in that way. In the old days, well, this is not actually the old days, we still do it today. If you want to insulate houses, by far the easiest way is to clad them in 10 centimeters of styrofoam on the outside. If you do it on the outside, you obviously ruin all the architectural features of a building. But it is much cheaper and also much more convenient. People can stay in their houses if you insulate them in this way. Nevertheless, for architects, this is rather disastrous, and that is also true for the old type of solar panels. Now we have much more sophisticated ones that you don't even recognize as solar panels. But this, nevertheless, no thanks to the negative aesthetic and architectural qualities, is a thing that has become inescapable. It would be good if we know to deal with them in a bit more clever, in a bit cleverer way. Also, a thing that is disastrous in many ways is industrial monocultural food production. Here you see a map showing foods being transported from monocultures far away from the rich countries to the rich countries. We cause monocultures very far away from the rich countries, ruining landscapes, ruining natures, also politically making these countries dependent on rich countries. So all kinds of disadvantages involved with all this, apart from this huge transportation machine itself being very unhealthy. So we should try to do something about it. We cannot do a lot about it, but some people, they urge for urban gardening and community gardens near our own cities. And what we already see in all cities is a definitive trend change where regional products have become much more popular than they were a long time ago. And then we come to the last part of this short lecture, and that is the hospital and the city. And now we try to come to a point where we merge the two components of this lecture. We talked about hospitals, then we talk about cities, and now we talk about hospitals and cities. And we focus on hospitals as kind of a focal point that may give us some clues for what we are facing today. And the first trend that we see today is a merger of the two strategies. I mentioned these reports by the World Health Organization that make very clear that the medical infrastructure is relatively unimportant in terms of public health, and that 90% of public health is impacted by other aspects, among them architecture and urbanism. And now we try to merge these two trends, and that has consequences in many fields, but also for hospitals. Hospitals should become more than crisis management institutions that target individual misery. They should also become informational hubs and social support hubs in the neighborhood. That gives them extra functions, which is very important because they may also lose some functions. Then the second trend is a very important one and has a huge impact on how we will organize the hospitals of the future. And that has to, it has a bearing, it has to do with care paths. And what you see at the bottom of this slide is a typical care path. You fall ill, you go to your general practitioner. He sends you to the drugstore, then maybe to a therapist. In the end, you may end up in a hospital, see specialist number one, then you go to another specialist, and you have a lot of steps in your care path. There are only two continuous things in this care path, and that is you yourself as a patient, but you are not fit, you are not in the best of conditions. The other thing is your patient file. If your patient file is not digital, it may get lost and people may not read it at all. And what has been found in many situations is that this is indeed the case, that each transfer from one step to the other is dangerous because information is lost. Often specialists, medical specialists, just simply don't have the time to read your file, and the file may not be available anyways. This needs to be changed. In the Netherlands alone, this causes several deaths each year. So this is a dangerous situation. Something needs to be done about that. And this can be done by empowering the patient. But the patient, of course, needs help. And the help can be in the form of all kinds of digital tools. And probably it also implies that general practitioners get a new role. But if we organize this in a different way, it will lead to a different composition of our hospitals and a different distribution model of all the medical steps that are involved in a care path. We come to that at this third trend, and that is indeed a redistribution of medical facilities. The trend moves in this direction. The general hospital that we have now will disappear. May take 5 years, may take 10 years, may take 15 years, but the trend is quite clear. It will disappear and it will be replaced by a system that has only a limited number of very big, super sophisticated hospitals. And on the other hand, very small community-based small hospitals. And the idea is that these small hospitals are very well capable of dealing with about 80% of everything that comes to them, that of patients that visit them, and the 20% that is too complex, these should be transferred to either these very big central hospitals, that are often also teaching hospitals, sometimes to what is called focused factories, that are not always big institutions, but these are super good in only one thing, for instance, doing something with the eyes or broken legs or something like that, focused factories. But the general hospital is a thing of the past. This leads to the evolution of new typologies. One is this small-scale community hospital. This is one in Welwyn, Garden City. It doesn't even have beds, but it can take care of a lot of the problems that people in the community have. And if there are problems that they cannot handle, then these people are transferred to a large hospital. And this is very important. A small hospital, and you are very well aware of this, this is the same everywhere on the planet. A small hospital that functions all on its own is very dangerous for health. If you come with a rare disease to them, they will try to treat you, but they just simply do not have the expertise, and you are in lethal danger. So only if they are in a position to transfer this type of patient to a decent hospital that does have the expertise, because they have a lot of turnover, because they practice this type of disease all the time, then you may be saved. This is one that I like quite a lot. It's from Spain. It's actually in Madrid. And it is a small community health center, very typically Spanish. The Spanish architects, they like their buildings to be sculptural and very beautiful as well, but they don't have a very clear relationship with the vicinity. In the terms of koolhaas, they fuck the environment, they fuck the city, but they are beautiful in their own right. And this is one by a firm that built a standard type and repeated it several times, but the materialization is completely different in all the three that they so far built. Maybe they built the fourth one by now. Here you see one that has a kind of a sophisticated plastic-like or glass-like surface. This one is made of concrete, and this is the plastic one again. Well, of course, it's not plastic; it's a different type of thing. And this is one that has this kind of architectural finishing. The program is the same. The size is almost the same. And the scheme is also almost the same. These are all health facilities. This is an example of the fifth trend, which is a Maggie Center. Everybody knows the Maggie Center, so I will not talk about it for too long. It's an initiative by Charles Jenks. His wife was Maggie. Maggie died of cancer. She came from a rich family. And they spent a lot of money and also collect a lot of money to build this type of center, the so-called Maggie centers, which do not do anything in terms of medical intervention at all. They are support centers. So they are built often quite near these super ugly, big general national health service hospitals that they have in Great Britain. And there they form kind of an island, a friendly island, where people go for social support to get help with gathering information, also practical help. If they get unemployed, they need kind of an arrangement. People who know how to do it come to this center and help them. So this is a support center. And it works very well. And there are many of these centers have been built. And since, of course, Charles Jenks is, or used to be, died recently, is a critic, architecture critic, knows all the famous architects. Many of these things have been built by famous architects. Here we have another one that has a small or a low level of medical support as well. It's a Danish one, a very beautiful one, hard on the outside, soft on the inside. This one is a Liversum. Same system, a bit clinical on the outside and very warm on the inside. Very beautiful. And that almost ends our lecture. These trends have to do with distribution, the urban processes in hospitals, the urban connection with hospitals. We end this series. Well, unfortunately, it is only one lecture. We could do 1 million lectures on different aspects that we have touched upon in this lecture. We now go to the hospital itself. Trends in hospital architecture that we see today. One trend is minimize transportation of patients. So instead of moving the patient through the entire hospital, from imaging to the operating theater to wherever, we see that this is not good at all. It is even can even be dangerous for health. So instead of doing that, we now do as many things as we can on the bedside. We even do some small bedside surgery. This is a very interesting building. Guys, cancer clinic. Actually, it is 3 medical villages, cancer clinics stacked one on top of the other, and all of them have everything that is needed for the category of patients that they have to deal with. So you multiply very important components of the hospital in order to make everything as bedside as you can. This is evidence-based design. It was kickstarted in 1984 by research by Roger Ulrich, who had patients in patient rooms after surgery. One group of patients had a view on greenery, the other group of patients had a view on a blind wall. And it turned out that the patients who had a view on greenery had a lot better, the health outcomes of these people were a lot better than those who had a view on a blind wall. And that kickstarted evidence-based design. And evidence-based design, actually, it caused the end of something that has been very, very important in the medical sciences for a very long time, and that is often referred to as the Cartesian dichotomy. And the Cartesian dichotomy maintains that there is no relationship whatsoever between human experiences, feelings, and emotions on the one hand, and the medical outcomes on the other hand. So the Cartesian dichotomy sees human beings as mechanisms. Health is a disease is a medical problem, and so you do something in terms of mechanics, and then you are better. We hope that you are better after that. Now we find that this is completely out of the order. It's completely old-fashioned. There is now the general recognition of the intimate connections between mind, soul on the one hand, and the physical state on the other hand. Experience has been recognized as very, very important. And that is why evidence-based design has become an important trend. Also slightly controversial, we will not discuss that, but it did, dig the grave of the Cartesian dichotomy. now we see that behavior, emotions, and everything that has to do with the mind is very important. And that is one of the reasons why design has re-entered hospital architecture as a kind of autonomous value in its own right. Behavior and lifestyles are important for health, and architecture and urbanism also in hospitals can have an impact on that. Well, what are these people talking about? They're talking about nature. This is a Maggie Center in Glasgow with a garden in the center, designed, I think, by the daughter of Charles Jenks and built by Koolhaas. Daylight, very, very important. People have to be in touch with daylight and also with the rhythms of day and night, circadian rhythm. This is very important in intensive care units. It has been found that intensive care units that have very bright light day and night and a lot of noise of all machines, all bleeps, bleep, 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 bleep. People there suffer from the intensive care units and it can easily and at no cost at all be prevented. The World Health Organization once labeled the old-fashioned intensive care units with light day and night and a lot of noise as qualifying as torture machines. So this needs to change, and it can change very easily. Even in operating theaters, daylight is important, not for the patient that much, of course. They are sleeping, let's call it sleeping, they won't notice, but for surgeons it is very, very important that they have access to daylight. If they have a choice working for a hospital that has operating theaters with daylight or one that does not have daylight, they will always choose the one with daylight. Single bedrooms, very important from the perspective of privacy, also helping in terms of bedside care and cure. And minimizing, of course, infections and things like that, and also medical errors. There are many medical errors in multiple patient rooms and a lot less in this type of patient room. Looks very luxurious, but it helps, and it's if you take into account the kind of money that you save by preventing infections and medical errors, it is very well affordable. And of course, social settings. Social settings have become very important as well. And this is one that we find in a recently, well, not that recently, realized Dutch hospital. It's a social setting, it's an urban setting, and at the same time, it has a view on greenery. And this is believed to be healthy. We started this short lecture with preliminary remarks. It is time now, the time has come to conclude with concluding remarks, a few of them. We said already that health is not a medical condition, and therefore what we see now is a shift to non-medical public health strategies. One of the reasons that we did not mention, but one of the reasons is that the medical intervention infrastructure just simply has become too expensive, and not a single country can afford it anymore, and that is not very efficient to begin with. So we now see a general shift to healthy cities, to architecture, and to urbanism. Then we have these epidemics and pandemics that we have today. Occasionally we have this. It cannot affect healthcare architecture in the long run. Now we need special emergency facilities, but these are temporary, and they are actually comparable with what we abolished after the Cold War. Maybe this is the same in Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic now. It was definitely the case in basically all Western countries. During the Cold War, we were preparing for the war, becoming a real war, and there were systems in place to take care of citizens that got hurt in air raids or in other consequences of warfare. After the Cold War, we abolished everything, and now we don't have it anymore. We never expected the type of catastrophe that we see now. We thought, well, we won't have any wars anymore, so we can do away with it. Now we found basically that an emergency system of that type should also always be in place. But it is an emergency system that can only work for specific emergencies. The normal situation that will return within 2 months or a year or so. Well, if we take a look at that and at what we need in terms of healthcare for the normal situation, then we still talk about the things that I have mentioned in this short lecture. In healthcare architecture, the collapse of the Cartesian dichotomy, well, that was one of the reasons that caused a reintroduction of design-based aspects. And these go way beyond logistical issues and process-based solutions. And that explains why today's star architects even have started to rediscover healthcare architecture. And I conclude with a few slides that prove that point. Very simple, and you undoubtedly have seen this project. We were supposed to visit it with Chinese hospital architects in June, but we had to postpone. I'm not sure when we're going to do it. Apart from all that, it's just the building site. The thing is not there. This is Herzog in the middle in Denmark, not far from Copenhagen. And it is what they claim to be the final solution to all problems that we have ever encountered in healthcare architecture. Well, if we take a close look at it, and if we know the history of healthcare topologies, then we see that it is not that new at all. It is a variation of the old Breitfuss typology, but a very clever variation and a very neatly designed one. And I only show it as proof that star architects work in this field of architecture. Again, of healthcare architecture. Again, actually, we just did a book on healthcare architecture. It was published in 2018. You will find it on the website of our center, the AUHEU site, and published in 2018 by Bierkaiser. We could have filled the entire book with the work of only star architects. Well, that does not necessarily mean that all these hospitals built by star architects are superior to the other hospitals. Not at all. Sometimes they are not at all superior, but it does illustrate the immense prestige that healthcare architecture has regained in the last few decades. And that, I think, was the last slide. Actually, I'm quite sure it was the last slide. So I give the floor back to Prague. Thanks for listening to this short.
Thank you, Professor. It was really interesting. Just short message for our audience. You're watching lecture of Professor Cor Wagenaar about architecture, urbanism, and health. And you had a chance to ask some questions, so I have them here right now, and I will ask Mr. Professor about them. First question that I think is interesting is which color is good for a hospital? Because you know that people say, okay, I like hospitals. They're white. They are maybe light blue, light green. Why they are white? It is because it looks like it's clean, or do we feel safe there?
Well, that's an interesting question, and the idea is that they have always been white, but this is not the case at all. They became white. White became the dominant color only when modernism became the dominant style of healthcare architecture, and that is actually quite late. There are beautiful examples, especially in sanatorium buildings in the 1930s. You know the Paimio in Finland, you know the Zonnestraal in the Netherlands, you know the sanatoria the Russians built on the Baltic coast, not the Baltic coast, the Black Sea coast. But these were quite exceptional, and before that, these hospitals were generally built in a more traditional style. Brick buildings, red brick buildings, representative architecture, and there are also very nice experiments, examples of hospitals in the 1910s that actually used a complete color palette of very soft colors. So they have not always been white, and there is no reason for them to be white. And the most recent hospitals that you see having been built in the last decade, they still use white as a color, but not as the dominant color. They also introduced warm materials. There is a lot of wood in present-day hospitals. There is color used on the walls. There is a famous one in the Netherlands, actually in the city of Groningen, that has very strong colors, very red, very green, very orange. So it's already a thing of the past, the idea that hospitals need to be white. But there are many different views on the colors that they should have. And so far as I can see, it is basically mostly determined by the taste of the architect. There is some research in colors, of course, but it does not affect hospital architecture in a very thorough way. Actually, one of the experts in colors and also in the effects of colors was a Hungarian guy, Anton Nemcic. He wrote a book. The English title is Color Dynamics, and he did a lot of research on the physical and the psychological effects of colors. But he remains a lonely soul, and I don't think it has a lot of impact on the colors of hospitals. Does that answer your question?
I guess yes. I have another one. What are the biggest mistakes that have been made in the past in city planning in terms of health?
Well, the biggest mistakes in terms of health in urban planning are the way we have sacrificed cities to the car. The car has disastrous effects as a machine itself. It produces noise and pollution. In terms of infrastructure, it creates streets, it necessitates streets that are very difficult for use by pedestrians and cyclists. It is a machinery that leads to urban sprawl, to suburbia, and urban sprawl, the suburban type of living, has been recognized as considerably less healthy than living either in villages or in compact cities. So the way we have sacrificed urban life to the car, in retrospect, that can be seen as the biggest mistake we made. I think that is really the biggest mistake.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, how does this architectural take on health in cities relate to urban planning as a profession? How they can cooperate to fulfill the same goal, which is healthier cities? So how architects and urban planners can cooperate?
Well, architects and urban planners can help to reconstruct our existing cities, and that is the most important task anyways. We can build new settlements according to the principles of healthy cities, meaning that they have to be fit for pedestrians, fit for cyclists, that there has to be greenery, that at the same time they have to be relatively dense, that there has to be a distribution model that has plenty of facilities on walking and cycling distance. That also calls for dense cities. It has to have a distribution model of social hubs, of places where people can meet. When this corona disaster is gone, I hope we go back to physical meetings again. We have to, because this is a quite healthy situation. In all these aspects, architects and urbanists can help. They can help, for instance, also to facilitate urban farmers markets. They can help to facilitate urban gardening, community gardens. They can help to make our buildings healthier, so they can help to mitigate the problems that are associated with unhealthy indoor climate. All these things are urban things, architectural things that call for design. And the effects of these interventions can actually be measured. On the side of this center, you will find a project that we are doing in a post-war housing estate, and we can indeed assess the impact of urban interventions, for instance, on the willingness and the possibilities of people, elderly people in this case, to walk. Now they see this housing estate as unfit for walking. They have to cross all kinds of barriers, busy streets. It's almost impossible to reach the shopping center. Well, these things can be redesigned. And if you put the redesigned situation in virtual reality, you can ask the people how this would change their daily living patterns by use of questionnaires, and it works. It really works. So there are plenty of opportunities to work in this direction. It does, of course, call for a more or less scientific approach to planning, but, and that is an interesting thing that I should stress, sometimes architects and urbanists are a bit afraid of scientific data. They say we have so many limitations already. There is the building code, there is the zoning scheme, there are the urbanists, there are the fire people, there are a million restraints already, not to mention the money. There's never enough money. And now these scientists, they come with extra limitations, and this will have a negative effect on our artistic freedom and on the aesthetic qualities of what we do. But another research we did in hospitals showed that those hospitals that were mostly inspired, that were most intimately and directly inspired by several evidence-based design principles, also had the highest score in terms of architecture quality. Now, architecture quality, of course, is a very difficult thing to measure, but you can measure it. I think your audience is made up of mainly of architects. Some of you, maybe all of you, are working as teachers as well, and we know very well which architect, which student is going to be a good architect and which one is going to be a hopeless one. We can see which buildings are discussed in the press and which ones are not. It is possible to assess architecture qualities. The only thing is we do not assess it in the way public health people and physical scientists, natural scientists study their objects. We don't assess it directly in terms of quantities. We assess it in terms of qualities. So instead of huge lists of numerical data, we have texts and narratives and things like that. So it can be done, and it is very safe to adapt and adopt these principles without being afraid of what it will do to your architectural and artistic freedom. It does not harm your freedom, it actually will only enhance it.
Thank you. Another question is, you mentioned people's health is generally harmed by life outside of urban areas. How can medical architecture help address this challenge?
What is the exact question? Does it relate to suburbia versus the metropolis?
Yeah. I guess it's related
that
to
is, and that is true. Well, the negative effects of suburbia have been discovered everywhere, even in the United States. And I showed Manhattan, but Manhattan is super exceptional in the United States. 99% of the people there lives in suburbia, and we know that it is unhealthy. So the major challenge is now in suburbia. What can we do to make suburbia healthier than it is now? It is impossible to just simply destroy suburbia. That cannot be done. We are stuck with it. And what we should do to make it healthier, that is something, that is the major challenge. There's not a simple solution to that. Many planners think that we need to densify. And densification is what we see in many, for instance, in many post-war housing estates in the Netherlands. And that can be done, and it can have a positive effect. It is also sometimes contradictory to, that may sound a bit weird, but to the architectural and urban qualities of the original post-war housing estates, which do have aesthetic qualities, they do have cultural values as well. So we have to strike a balance between the aesthetic qualities that are inherent in these housing estates and the requirements of healthy cities. But there is no simple solution to that. What is clear is that you can do a lot by, taking a look at what we can call the healthy city matrix. So do something in terms of spaces, social spaces, making outdoor life fit for social gatherings again, introduce community gardens, introduce greenery, also as a means to mitigate help what's called the heat island effect. So we can do a lot, but it is the most difficult challenge that we face. That is the thing, basically.
Yeah, great. And the last question is, what are the ways of determining the health impacts of architecture when controlled experiments are difficult? How we find out what's good for us and what's wrong?
How we find out what is good for us and what is wrong? If we want to find out in terms of health outcomes, then as architects and urbanists and theorists and people working in this field, we are relying on the work of public health experts who have assessed the effect of lifestyles on public health. Not all of these lifestyles can be affected by architecture and urbanism, but a lot of them can be affected by architecture and urbanism, and these have to do with mobility, with greenery, and with the other things that I mentioned. If we are able to make cities more dense, more walkable, more cyclable, greener, then we know that this will have a positive effect. But the positive effect itself, measuring this positive effect, is something that we have not been educated for. And this we can only do in an effective way by cooperating with the public health experts, with the people who have the data, which, by the way, is quite complex. Many of these data are not available at the neighborhood level, and that is what you need. And other data are available, but they are owned by commercial companies. And as you know, data is the new oil. The old economy was, revolving around oil. Oil was the most expensive thing on the planet. This is a thing of the past. Now it is data. And part of the data are just simply expensive. You have to buy them. So there are lots of problems in this field of cooperation. Nevertheless, this is the only way out. The only way out is bridge the gap between the designers who have to learn to understand the language of the scientists, public health experts, and the public health experts who, and this is hardly exaggerated, have no idea about spatial qualities, not at the level of buildings and not at the level of cities. So bridging this gap is the essential thing that needs to be done in order to use architecture and urbanism as one of the tools to improve public health.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'm really happy you joined us, and I hope we will meet you in Prague in person with audience.
I hope so too. This was a bit experimental, of course, but I hope it worked out. I think we have a meeting planned, or at least we plan to plan a meeting. Now, as far as thing, we don't know how long it takes, but I definitely plan to come to Prague and see you in real life.
Great. Thank you very much and have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye. Sledovali jste přednášku Cora Wagenára, profesora o architektuře, urbanismu a zdraví. Věnovali jsme se jí právě trošku z toho důvodu, že o zdraví se teď bavíme úplně všichni a záměrně jsme to téma koronaviru z ní vynechávali. Jak pan profesor říkal, neovlivní to architekturu medicínských staveb a tak dále. Je to něco, co je dočasné. My se musíme zaměřit na zdravý rozvoj měst a musíme se zaměřit na to, jak města budou vypadat nadále, aby se vám v nich hezky žilo, aby jsme v nich byli zdraví. Vy si záznam té přednášky potom budete moct prohlédnout na našem YouTube. Je to youtube.com/Camp Praha. Tam najdete záznamy všech přednášek od roku 2017, takže pokud by vás nezajímala architektura a zdraví, můžete se věnovat třeba brutalistní architektuře s Vladimírem 518 nebo přednáškám Miroslava Šika, nebo třeba velkým změnám Prahy s náměstky Petrem Hlaváčkem a Adamem Scheinerem. Všechno tam najdete. Nezapomínejte sledovat náš web campuj.online, tam jsme se teďka přesunuli po dobu toho, co je kemp zavřený, takže doufám, že si tam brzo přečtete něco, co vás zajímá a jak jsem říkal, je připravený podcast, je tady YouTube, je tady všechno, abyste mohli tu karanténu a ten nouzový stav nějak přečkat. Takže mějte se hezky, buďte na sebe hodní a příjemný zbytek večera.